The Bellcraft seems to have been an amalgamation of a variety of technologies that included things from ancient texts, from inventors, as well as intuitively derived information through various sources such as Maria Orsic, the Vril Society, and their own records from the Order of the Black Sun.
When Rudolf Hess witnessed Maria Orsic as she channeled his deceased friend Dietrich Eckart, he became convinced that she was the real deal. Rudolf Hess had served time in prison with Adolf Hitler, and they knew each other well. It's presumed that it was Hess who told Hitler about Maria Orsic, her channeling sessions with the light beings of Aldebaran, and most importantly, her flying discs. Famed scientist Winifred Schumann recognized that the flying saucer plans, channeled by Maria, closely resembled the work of Austrian scientist Victor Schauberger. It was just after Hess revealed what Maria Orsic was really up to that the Germans essentially kidnapped Schauberger and put him to work on the German flying saucers. But who was Victor Schauberger, and what did he discover?
Victor Schauberger was an Austrian inventor who worked actually during World War II with the Third Reich. And he's well known for his vortex mechanics. And he worked a lot with water vortexes. He was early on very interested in the way water purified itself in streams through natural swirling and whirlpools and things. And so the whole idea of what we would call vortex technology, and in a sense using water in this case, was really pioneered by Victor Schauberger.
So Schauberger was studying the behaviors of salmon as they would glide up through the waterfall, and trout as they would stay in one place in the stream and hardly have to do any movement, and they wouldn't be moving with the current. And what he determined was that there were certain what he called implosion vortexes that were created in the water by the way the water was spinning. Schauberger then created turbines that recreated this inside a mechanical array that was egg-shaped, and this became an anti-gravity engine. Schauberger was abducted by the Germans, kidnapped along with his family, tortured, and was then forced to participate in this Hanebu Bellcraft program.
Victor Schauberger is a physicist who created a device called a repulsine, which used vortex generation to actually create lift and maneuverability of disc-shaped objects. The interesting thing about his techniques is that Schauberger actually believed that we were doing things wrong in physics. He said that birds did not fly, they were flown, and fish did not swim, they were swum. So all you really had to do is tap into the forces that existed in the ether around us, and you could actually generate movement and theoretical performance like a flying saucer.
Schauberger invented a number of unusual items and devices, including a flying saucer kind of device that worked as a vortex, sort of flying tornado vortex, similar to a gyro also. It's curious with Schauberger's devices in that it's quite possible that an aircraft, particularly a flying saucer kind of aircraft, could actually be powered by water as the vortex.
The issue regarding the Nazis and their flying saucer research is there is a basis in fact here. You know, we all know now that there were certain German scientists during World War II, I think most prominently Victor Schauberger, who were doing very interesting, let's say brilliant, let's say even genius-level work on disc-shaped airframes. Schauberger was a self-taught genius who was then commandeered by the SS to work for them during the war. He did create disc-shaped craft. They were tested.
And the fact is the Germans are very bright guys. You know, there's the old joke that heaven is where the mechanics are German. You know, hell is where the police are German. The Germans were brilliant, absolutely brilliant engineers. And it looks like there's a trace all the way back to 18th century Prussia, where they were working on and interested in developing technologies, airship technologies and anti-gravity technologies. So I don't think that the aliens are required for the Germans to have achieved the things that they achieved technologically. It wouldn't hurt. And there's also the fact that you have people like Hermann Oberth, who was actually the mentor of Dr. Werner von Braun. The physicist behind von Braun's engineering said we had help from people from other worlds.
In my mind, you have a similar thing with Victor Schauberger as with the ancient Hindu texts on Vimanas, which talk about Mercury being part of the power system of these ancient craft. And supposedly using Mercury would be also in a kind of a Schauberger type vortex, but you'd be using Mercury instead of water. And Mercury has many unusual qualities. It's an element, it's a metal, it's a liquid, it's a conductor. You can do things with Mercury that you can't really do with any other metal or liquid or element, really. And that would be creating things like Mercury gyros. And a Mercury gyro would then be a sealed gyro with Mercury inside it, moving as a liquid in a vortex and gyroscopic kind of action. And then if you were to introduce electricity into that gyro of Mercury, you would electrify that Mercury and it would become a plasma, an electrified gas that's spinning in a toroidal or gyroscopic type movement. And scientists have used gyroscopes for years as an example of artificial gravity and anti-gravity. So in a sense, a craft that's using this kind of vortex technology, especially one with Mercury, is a very viable kind of flying saucer type craft. And the other interesting thing about such a craft like that is that once you introduced electricity to the Mercury vortex, it's going to light it up, and the thing will be extremely bright. So if you were to see this thing flying, it would be much as many UFOs are described, where they are this spinning top kind of gyro thing that's also very brightly lit, sometimes with even lights that are flashing or flickering or spinning along the edge of the craft. And this is exactly how a Mercury gyro would really look like and act like.
Well, the Germans were mounting expeditions all over the world in the 1930s because they were looking primarily for mystical devices. You know, their technology was very, very advanced. Their aviation technology was way beyond anything the United States developed.
The ancients were fascinated with Mercury all over the world. The Chinese and the ancient Mexicans and Mayans, and Mercury is usually an offshoot of gold production, actually. But yeah, when you have the ancient texts, like the Vimana texts, Mercury is clearly talked about there. So Mercury was a very important thing for the ancient people. But Mercury is a deadly poison. Working with Mercury, you shouldn't do that. Mercury gas is completely deadly. Mercury needs to be handled very, very carefully and in a closed environment. So exactly what ancient people were doing with Mercury is kind of a mystery, although spacecraft and stuff is really the obvious thing to do with it, and other mining technologies. Mercury really comes from a mineral called cinnabar, and cinnabar is a Sanskrit word. So even geologically and mineralogically, words for Mercury and cinnabar come really from ancient Sanskrit. Mercury, too, in Western tradition, Mercury was the Greek god of communication. He flew through the air. And so with the ancient people, it would seem that Mercury and flight are very carefully associated with each other.
Using Schauberger's vortex technology, the Germans perfected the device they called the bell. What other research were the Germans doing during this period of time?
I like to put it this way. If you stop and think of the modern American or Western military arsenal, stealth aircraft, guided missiles, heat-seeking guided missiles, acoustic homing missiles, lasers, fiber optic communication, telephony by optical communication rather than radio waves, fuel air bombs, thermobaric bombs, particle beams, directed energy weapons. We could go on and on and on. Well, the bottom line is that if you look at the Nazi arsenal as it stood at the conclusion of World War II in Europe, what you have is basically an inventory, or a catalog, if you will, of all of the weapons systems that we now take for granted in their Generation 1 prototypical form.
If there's one thing we can say for sure about the Nazis during the Second World War, it's that their technology was highly advanced, in many respects far more advanced than the Allies, even though that ultimately, thank goodness, we won the war. Their scientists, for example, in the fields of rocketry, like biological warfare, chemical warfare, they were years ahead of everybody else. And it's really only due to the fact that Hitler sort of took on the entire planet that eventually he got overwhelmed. You know, he had the Allies coming from one side, the Russians from the other. And then, of course, Japan fell when we developed the atomic bomb, and that brought the war to an end. But had all of that not happened, the chances are that the Germans probably would have won if Hitler had sort of taken on one place at a time and then another and another.
The Germans primarily did their saucer research in an area of what is now Poland called Silesia. And it's really interesting because this is the area where the original Prussian researchers were situated back in the 1800s that sent people to America to do airship research, in my opinion anyway. And it was also the area that Hitler protected to the very, very last moment at the end of World War II. If you look at the pattern of the Third Army of General Patton, they crossed the Rhine, and at that moment the big political prize is Berlin. We all wanted to beat the Russians to Berlin because to possess Berlin meant that we possessed Germany. Instead, Patton is diverted directly to Silesia because that was the area where they had the Nazi Bell, other technologies they were developing, super weapons that Hitler talked about, and that had to be protected at all costs. So it must have really galled Patton that he couldn't go get the prize, which was Berlin, and instead he had to go to Silesia and capture these German technology factories. The Nazis got very far in their technological research. Hitler kept telling everybody that there were going to be super weapons, wonder weapons that were going to come out of there that were going to save Nazi Germany. Of course, they developed the jet fighters, the Me-262, the fastest, most amazing jet aircraft in the world at the time. They developed the Horten HO-229, which I happen to think is what Kenneth Arnold saw in 1947, a squadron of HO-229s operating out of McChord Air Force Base near Mount Rainier.
Through the FBI, I actually got probably about 7 or 8 really interesting documents, that essentially interviews that the FBI had done at the end of the Second World War with like Luftwaffe pilots and German military personnel who claimed to have seen saucer-like craft being test flown at military bases in both Germany and Austria. And they were sort of anywhere from 30 feet to 60 feet in diameter, and for want of a better term, flying saucers. And these interviews were taken very seriously, and the FBI has now actually loaded them onto their website, The Vault, so you can read them there. And for that reason, I do think there's a good evidence that the Nazis were working on circular aircraft, which, you know, potentially could have not just worked in the Earth's atmosphere, but outside of the atmosphere.
After the war, it's generally believed that the Germans took their research from Nazi Germany to Norway, and eventually from Norway to Argentina, and eventually from Argentina to Antarctica, where they had secret bases in New Schwabenland. The Germans had the technology, but they didn't have the resources. And that was the big problem. They ultimately lacked oil. Germany does not have a lot of oil. They needed oil. They needed electricity. They needed generating plants. They needed to have the facilities to manufacture the weapons. So even though they were very much ahead of us in terms of theoretical research, they were only at the very end of the war beginning to take some of these theoretical super weapons and actually mechanize them, engineer them into reality. Had the war gone on another year, we would have lost it. The Haunebu saucers should have been capable of going almost anywhere. I mean, the fact is that the Bell would generate not only a lifting capability and an anti-gravity effect, it would also tend to generate a protective field, almost a force field around the craft that would make it impervious to conventional weapons, and would also enable you to fly in space and not have to worry about things like radiation and all the different hazards. Meteors would bounce right off the shield. So it makes a lot of sense that they would have been able to actually go to the moon as far back as the 1940s with this technology. All you do is you just keep going up. You just keep moving in one direction, and pretty soon you're in space, and then you just point at the moon and go there.
Supposedly World War II ended with the Allies really entering Berlin in 1945, but really World War II didn't end there. And what apparently happened was the Germans of the Third Reich had created a number of isolated and forward bases around the world, using particularly their U-boat fleet, but also with other commercial ships and aircraft as well. And they already, towards the end of the war, apparently had begun building flying saucer type craft. And there's also the famous Foo Fighters that were seen at the end of the war over Germany. And while some researchers seem to think that Foo Fighters were some kind of extraterrestrial observation craft, just watching the end of World War II or something, other researchers believe that the Germans had really created the Foo Fighters and that they were really sort of a high-tech, last-ditch effort by the Germans to stop the bombing raids and what was the carpet bombing of the industrial cities in Germany. With the end of the World War II, the Germans were really escaping, and with their vast U-boat fleet, to places in Greenland and the Canary Islands, to South America, also going to Indonesia and Japan, and incredibly to Antarctica, where the Germans had started to create certain bases, underground, undersea U-boat bases in an area that they called New Schwabenland, and which we today call Queen Maud Land. And this is the part of Antarctica that's pretty much opposite of South Africa, really. And South Africa, too, actually, was a government at the time that wanted to side with the Germans during World War II. And the Afrikaners of South Africa did. And the British actually put, many of the politicians in South Africa in prison during the entire war because they were on the side of the Germans. So really, World War II apparently continued.
Well, of course, since that's a real hidden part of history, I don't think anybody knows for sure what happened to the German saucers. What we know for absolute positive is that they had the plans, the drawings were on the drawing board, okay? The only argument is, did they actually ever fly any? The Philadelphia experiment, I think, was a legitimate experiment. I think they were experimenting with energy manipulation. It was very similar to what the Nazis were doing with the Bell. The entire universe basically is a huge energy field, and we're all part of it. Okay, and so when you start messing with that, you really just don't know what's going to happen.
What the Allies seemed to finally realize, particularly after 2 U-boats surrendered after the war in Argentina, they realized that the Germans had a fleet of black U-boats, and that there was a large number of U-boats that were completely unaccounted for at the end of the war. And 2 surrendered in Argentina. Some months after the war. And both the British and American military forces, they took the captains and the crew of these U-boats, prisoners, and interrogated them for months of where they had been all this time after the war, what kind of passengers and cargo they had been carrying. And in fact, some of these U-boats were apparently carrying huge cargoes of mercury. Which is a very strange thing. And is looking into all that over time, I found that there was a U-boat that had been wrecked in Indonesia during the war, and its cargo was mercury. And then, only a few years ago, it was in Norwegian papers that a U-boat had been found sunken in a fjord in Norway, and it had been sunken in like 1944 or 1945. And the interesting part of that story was that the Norwegian authorities were worried that this sunken U-boat would fracture and crack, and that its cargo of mercury would leak into this fjord and poison it. So here again, you have one of these strange missing U-boats with a cargo of mercury. Then the Allies realized that there was something more going on that parts of the Third Reich were still active, and that they were active particularly in South America and Antarctica.
So the rat lines were through Switzerland, through Marco, Spain, and through the Vatican. And that's where all the SS officers kind of went and were allowed to change their identity and then, you know, take on other lives in other places. Obviously, there were a lot of people that came to the United States and Canada, Operation Paperclip, and then even some went to Russia. A lot were allowed to stay in Germany and actually carry on.
Even though the Allies won World War II, there were nagging suspicions that something was wrong. Under intense questioning by the Allies, it became apparent that the Germans had built a secret base in Antarctica. Rumors were spreading that the Germans had developed special weapons, which were being kept near the South Pole. Admiral Richard Byrd was assigned the task of finding out what was going on.
Some strange things happened during Operation High Jump, and allegedly craft flew out from the aircraft carriers over Antarctica, and they were involved in some kind of aerial combat with flying saucers. And the flying saucers defeated the American Navy. And they left after 3 months. Operation High Jump came to an end, and the Americans left Antarctica.
But I think the crux came in early 1947 with Operation High Jump, where Admiral Byrd, a whole military expedition, goes down to Antarctica, where the Nazis had made it very plain that they had built a huge base down there, sometimes referred to as Agartha, and that they had located underground lakes of warm water, and that they had these caverns they were operating out of. And of course, we don't know for certain if any of that's true. What we know for certain is Admiral Byrd, Operation High Jump, goes down there, all equipped with troops, airplanes. I mean, it was a military expedition, and they were set to operate for 9 months. Well, after about 3 months, they came back with their tail between their legs after having suffered casualties, all kind of problems.
They sent this massive task force, including an aircraft carrier, tons of aircraft, a couple of destroyers, to Antarctica. They set up a base, and then basically what they did, if you look at it, is their exploration pattern was from the base, which is at one end of Antarctica, around to New Schwabenland, where the rumors are that there actually was a confrontation with Nazi flying saucers who devastated the American army. They packed the whole thing up and ran back to the United States. And later on, Admiral Byrd was quoted as saying basically that there are spacecraft or aircraft that are so fast and so maneuverable and so powerful that they are going to come at us from all different directions from the poles, and we're not going to be able to defend against them. So clearly, Byrd is talking about what he saw in Antarctica in the battle that took place there in 1946.
And Admiral Byrd then stopped in Santiago, Chile, on his way back to the United States. And he had a press conference in Santiago where he said a bunch of bizarre comments and talking about, a whole new enemy, a whole new technology, and that they were capable of flying, that these craft could fly from pole to pole, is what Byrd said. And this is where some of the stories of the Hollow Earth started to come out, and strange stories that were promoted in magazines in the 1950s of UFOs in Antarctica, holes in the poles, and that Antarctica was some very special place within the UFO scene.
They actually brought a whole army there to snuff out whatever was left over, and they got their asses kicked, and they came home, and I think Admiral Byrd was very upset. I don't think maybe he thought he wasn't adequately prepared, and I think they killed him just because he was raising hell about that.
And Admiral Byrd in the South American newspapers was quoted as saying, in the next war, we'll be facing craft that can fly from pole to pole in a matter of minutes. I think they encountered the Nazi UFOs.
Between Operation High Jump, which supposedly encountered Nazi UFOs, and the crash at Roswell, which possibly could have been alien, between those two events, they seem to really fire things up and begin the creation of what we now call the national security state. The CIA was formed actually in 1947. The NSA was formed in the early 1950s. All of these events seem to be connected. The biggest event was the 1952 buzzing of Washington, D.C., and after that is when all of these agencies like DARPA came into existence, the Defense Advanced Resources Projects Agency. All of these different organizations came into being and started to work together and started to deal with this question of what were these flying saucer-like objects that were actually swarming all over the country at the time. So I think there was a definite connection between that military catastrophe in Antarctica, Kenneth Arnold's sighting, the Roswell crash, the 1952 buzzing of Washington. I think it created panic at the highest levels of government, and that's when the whole national security state came into existence.
Look there. The compass is in a spin.
Geiger's up to the top.
It was just a few years after Operation High Jump that Hollywood began to tell their version of the Operation High Jump and UFO story, only with a dark twist.
Part of an airfoil, probably a stabilizer of some sort.
We found a flying saucer.
In 1951, famed Hollywood director Howard Hawks would release his film The Thing from Another World.
The other one if we need it. A few minutes from now, we may have the key to the stars. 1,000,000 years of history are waiting for us in that ice.
In this hit movie, a military team stationed at the pole discovers a flying saucer buried in the ice. Using thermite bombs in an attempt to get the saucer out of the ice, they inadvertently destroy the craft. But the explosion also frees the sole occupant of the flying saucer.
Captain, I'm getting something over here.
Probably a fragment from the saucer. You may salvage something yet.
Here's where it's coming from.
What is it? Looks like a man. Yeah, it's got legs and a head. I can see him. Yeah, he must be over 8 feet long.
The creature, the thing from another world, defrosts and begins attacking the members of the polar expedition. The Thing from Another World was the first of what would become many attempts by Hollywood to rewrite history, to play the aggressive alien card and show that fear and terror is the only proper response to otherworldly subjects.
I'm not your enemy. I'm a scientist. I'm a scientist who's trying.
It would not be the last.
One of the world's greatest battles was fought and won today by the human race. Here at the top of the world, a handful of American soldiers and civilians met the first invasion from another planet. And now, before giving you the details of the battle, I bring you a warning. Every one of you listening to my voice, tell the world, tell this to everybody wherever they are. Watch the skies, everywhere.
In our next episode of Deep Space, we'll continue to explore the relationship between the Germans and the Americans.
The Bell craft seems to have been an amalgamation of a variety of technologies that included things from ancient texts, from inventors, as well as intuitively derived information through various sources such as Maria Osric, the Vril Society, and their own records from the Order of the Black Sun.
When Rudolf Hess witnessed Maria Osric as she channeled his deceased friend Dietrich Eckart, he became convinced that she was the real deal. Rudolf Hess had served time in prison with Adolf Hitler, and they knew each other well. It's presumed that it was Hess who told Hitler about Maria Osric, her channeling sessions with the light beings of Aldebaran, and most importantly, her flying discs. Famed scientist Winifred Schumann recognized that the flying saucer plans, channeled by Maria, closely resembled the work of Austrian scientist Victor Schauberger. It was just after Hess revealed what Maria Osric was really up to that the Germans essentially kidnapped Schauberger and put him to work on the German flying saucers. But who was Victor Schauberger, and what did he discover?
Victor Schauberger was an Austrian inventor who worked actually during World War II with the Third Reich. And he's well known for his vortex mechanics. And he worked a lot with water vortexes. He was early on very interested in the way water purified itself in streams through natural swirling and whirlpools and things. And so the whole idea of what we would call vortex technology, and in a sense using water in this case, was really pioneered by Victor Schauberger.
So Schauberger was studying the behaviors of salmon as they would glide up through the waterfall, and trout as they would stay in one place in the stream and hardly have to do any movement, and they wouldn't be moving with the current. And what he determined was that there were certain what he called implosion vortexes that were created in the water by the way the water was spinning. Schauberger then created turbines that recreated this inside a mechanical array that was egg-shaped, and this became an anti-gravity engine. Schauberger was abducted by the Germans, kidnapped along with his family, tortured, and was then forced to participate in this Hanebu Bellcraft program.
Victor Schauberger is a physicist who created a device called a repulsine, which used vortex generation to actually create lift and maneuverability of disc-shaped objects. The interesting thing about his techniques is that Schauberger actually believed that we were doing things wrong in physics. He said that birds did not fly, they were flown, and fish did not swim, they were swum. So all you really had to do is tap into the forces that existed in the ether around us, and you could actually generate movement and theoretical performance like a flying saucer.
Schauberger invented a number of unusual items and devices, including a flying saucer kind of device that worked as a vortex, sort of flying tornado vortex, similar to a gyro also. It's curious with Schauberger's devices in that it's quite possible that an aircraft, particularly a flying saucer kind of aircraft, could actually be powered by water as the vortex.
The issue regarding the Nazis and their flying saucer research is there is a basis in fact here. You know, we all know now that there were certain German scientists during World War II, I think most prominently Victor Schauberger, who were doing very interesting, let's say brilliant, let's say even genius-level work on disc-shaped airframes. Schauberger was a self-taught genius who was then commandeered by the SS to work for them during the war. He did create disc-shaped craft. They were tested.
And the fact is the Germans are very bright guys. You know, there's the old joke that heaven is where the mechanics are German. You know, hell is where the police are German. The Germans were brilliant, absolutely brilliant engineers. And it looks like there's a trace all the way back to 18th century Prussia, where they were working on and interested in developing technologies, airship technologies and anti-gravity technologies. So I don't think that the aliens are required for the Germans to have achieved the things that they achieved technologically. It wouldn't hurt. And there's also the fact that you have people like Hermann Oberth, who was actually the mentor of Dr. Werner von Braun. The physicist behind von Braun's engineering said we had help from people from other worlds.
In my mind, you have a similar thing with Victor